good to talk to everybody this afternoon. So thank you. Yeah, sorry. So Peter's on, is he? Peter Addison. Hello, Peter. How are you? I've just noticed your name in the chat there. Yes. So yes, quite experienced. That means I'm very old. That's the polite way of putting it. I have been around an awful long time. So started with Emerson and did some 25 years, but all told some 35 years experience with control systems across a number of industries. So OT cybersecurity, why does this matter? Well, critical infrastructure is under attack. I think probably we would all agree that. I currently live in a part of the world that's very reliant on critical infrastructure, but at the same time, it also becomes our soft underbelly. We live in a part of the world here in the Middle East where 95% of our GDP probably comes from the oil and gas industry, and so that becomes a very attractive target to people, and an easy way to cripple a country. And I think, as most people probably understand, it's when we first started out, I suppose, and we're only 7 or 8 years into our journey, if you like. It was probably only 2017, 2018 that we started to take cybersecurity seriously in the OT world, in the ICS world. Before then, we were under the perhaps mistaken belief that we were air gapped. So we're relatively new to this, but a lot of the gone are the days when, if you look at the Hollywood stereotype of the big fat guy in his boxer shorts sat in his mother's basement. We've moved on a long way since then, and the concerning thing now is that cybersecurity, even in the OT world, is big business. We're being attacked by organized crime syndicates using ransomware, cyber warfare. We talk a lot about cyber warfare, and I use the example here of the Ukraine power grid, which was attacked, back in 2015, 2016, and that was a real world consequence of poor OT security. And that once they were compromised, thousands of homes were without any sort of power for much of the 2015, 2016 calendar years. Unlike IT, OT is a real-time deterministic and high consequence environment, and from in terms of consequence and impact, that has to be an important part of our consideration when we're deciding how to protect our critical infrastructure. In the IT world, of course, the impact or the consequences potentially you lose a business system, or you lose your email ability to email for half an hour. In our world, the consequence or the impact is considerably higher. We could lose power, not just at the plant, but of course the surrounding areas. It impacts badly on potentially on the influence and also the standing of the company. And then, of course, if we lose a particular part of plant, if it's a rotating equipment, for example, that shuts down unexpectedly, that can lead to damage of the asset, that can lead to an unplanned shutdown, or worse, it can lead to injury or death. So this is why it matters. This is why we need to take this seriously. Gopal, next slide, please. So for me, and this is something that I've been talking about for a long time now, it all starts with asset management. I still, to this day, find it very surprising when I work on a new assignment or go and talk to asset owners. I find it really surprising how few of them have a full and complete asset inventory. A lot of end users will have an asset inventory taken from, IDS, for example, but I would still argue then that there's a lot more work to be done, and IDS to some extent, or at least some of the IDS will use MAC addresses, to pick up on the make model, for example, but asset management goes so much deeper. Asset management, to me at least, is all around tracking, the documents, the governance, and it's the life cycle of an asset, so switches, relays, HMIs, comms gear, your servers, all of those assets from level 1, level 2, level 3 in the Purdue model, in our OT environment. We're tracking right from the very beginning. So from the procurement all the way through to the decommissioning stage, and we need to ensure rather that, every asset is accounted for. Asset management serves as the single source of truth for our OT security. It's very difficult to plan and mitigate against any type of risk unless you have a full and complete asset management program. Next slide, Gopal. And that leads us into vulnerability management, and this is where I take a fairly firm stance when I talk with asset owners, with end users. I've gone into end users and they've confidently told me that, we've got a full vulnerability management program, or we've got a full risk management program. And first question I'll ask is, well, that's great. That's encouraging. Can I see your asset inventory? And you'll be surprised, as I said on the previous slide, how many companies cannot actually show that to me. And I would argue that if you don't know what you've got, how can you have a vulnerability management program? How can you mitigate against the threats if you don't know what you've got? And if we look at what vulnerability management is, it's essentially the process of identifying, assessing, prioritizing, and mitigating against security weaknesses. So again, if we don't know what we've got, how are we assessing those weaknesses? How do we understand what they are? So asset management is the bedrock on which we build a full and complete cybersecurity management program. That's where we start. Vulnerability management, I've said here, it includes the hardware, the firmware, the configuration vulnerabilities. But I would also take that one step further and say that, and especially when we do a gap analysis, which will lead to your vulnerabilities, when I do a gap analysis or am involved, we'll look at not just the technology, but we'll look at the people and the processes. Unfortunately, we're all OT professionals on this call, but our various levels or varying levels of competence when it comes to the cybersecurity part probably varies so much. And I find throughout organizations that the people can quite often be the weak point. In terms of identifying issues in the first place, we talk a lot about awareness. Operators and even admin staff working in the office environment, these are quite often the people on the front line. These are the people that will see those telltale signs of compromise, whether it be, passwords not working, network slowing down, strange movement on the address, blue screens. We've all seen the blue screens, and unless these people are not necessarily full training, but at least given the awareness as to what to look for as an indicator of a potential attack or a threat or a compromise, unless these people are aware, then that's very much a vulnerability. Your procedures, policies, procedures, standards internally. This is also a big part of vulnerability management. We're all aware, obviously, of patch management. Patch management is incredibly difficult in the OT environment, and probably even more so in the substation environment where we have to run 24/7. Patching is very difficult, and as a result, I see probably the majority of the substations I go and see. I saw some yesterday down in Khobar here in Saudi. And when I look at these, I see a system that is unchanged for perhaps 20 years, running Windows NT, no firewalls, no controls of any sort, because back 20 years ago, we didn't see cybersecurity as a threat in our OT environment. So vulnerability management is an absolute key, but don't limit yourself to the technology. Please, as well as technology, consider the people and the processes. But again, you have to start with the asset management first. So next slide, please, go. So the synergy is there, and the bottom line, as I keep stressing, is that you can't fix what you don't know exists. So you've got to have a thorough understanding what you've got. And only if you've got all of that asset data available, can you then begin to do the correlation? Can you then begin to look at the CVE databases and understand what threats are out there, what vulnerabilities you have, and then the threats that are out there, which ones are relevant to your environment, to your OT environment. And once you get that synergy, once you've got a good understanding of your assets and good understanding of your vulnerabilities as an organization, then you can start to be quite clever about how you protect. We all follow the standards, but one thing that is common, I think, and I think everybody on the call will appreciate this, is that, IT for a long time has had a very nice budget for cybersecurity. I have yet to meet anybody in the OT world that has told me, yes, I've got a budget will allow me to do everything I want to do. And unfortunately, the accountants, the decision makers up at the board level are still not quite there understanding the risks in the OT world. But if you've got a good understanding of your asset base and therefore a good understanding of your vulnerabilities, we can start to get quite creative with where we deploy our controls, where we spend our money, where we spend our time, and perhaps move into a more risk-based approach. Those of you that came from a maintenance background as I did, 10, 15 years ago, we started to talk about risk-based maintenance. And I think the approach that we can start to adopt in the cybersecurity world is probably something similar. Once we understand our assets and our vulnerabilities, we can start to prioritize in terms of criticality. Perhaps our top 20%, as we used to in the maintenance world. Analyze so that we identify our top 20 critical assets where the impact or the consequence on your process is the greatest, and start to apply our budget based there, the 80-20 rule. So certainly, understanding the asset and the vulnerability and proper management programs there allows you to be more risk-based and certainly allows you to make much better decisions, I think, around how you protect. As we're all aware, in OT cybersecurity, there's no silver bullet. We need to be we need to be very focused on what we're doing, and as well as having no silver bullet. We need to be very conscious of the fact that this is not one time or one fits all. This needs to be continued over a period of time. Next slide, please, Gopal. So if any of you are looking at the question, Peter makes a good comment there about one of the challenges is the compensating controls for legacy assets, and this is a big problem for a lot of customers. I've just come off one project where we basically did a roadmap over 4 or 5 years and breaking it down. So over the next 4 or 5 years. A number of the substations were going to be upgraded. The SCADA was going to be upgraded anyway. So that enabled us a great opportunity to get in and develop or implement the cybersecurity controls at that time. But just to Peter's point there, it also gives, I think, asset owners an opportunity to assess their current situation. Don't wait until you're upgrading your SCADA. There are things you can do, and such as the basics of perhaps a hardening exercise, going in, making sure that and I'm in substations all the time where I hook into a switch and it's default username and password. There's been no sweep looking for ransomware or bugs of any type over a period of time. Checking through roles and responsibilities, checking through your privileges. We should all be looking to look at our privileges as least privilege in any environment, making sure we go through all of that. So there are a number of things you can do. Mapping a roadmap over a period of time is absolutely the way to go, as Peter says there. Without proper management, I think you open yourselves up to greater risk. There's the risk of expanding on our attack surface. Gone are the days, I think, when we were truly air gapped. And the problem now is that still 90% of the risk comes from the outside world. Comes from your enterprise, from the IT world, from your level 4, your level 5. That's where the risk is still coming from. So we need to be very careful in how we segment IT and OT. A lot of optimization systems will sit up in the corporate environment. CMMS perhaps sits up there. Your Maximo, your SAP perhaps sits up there. And remote access now, especially since COVID, a lot of us have gone to remote access and are still at that point where we're allowing our own people, but also possibly vendors to access our sites remotely. So we need to be very careful on how we manage that. As Peter said there, substations are often running, legacy systems that aren't patched or even monitored. And I fully appreciate that, we can't just barrel in air and start patching your servers. If you're running a large population of legacy systems, it can be a very expensive process to get back up to speed again, because you're probably going to find that your infrastructure is outdated, the servers that you're running, and therefore the operating system on the servers are well behind. And even if you address that, you're then going to get the potential mismatches between your servers and the operating system of your SCADA. So there's lots of things that you need to take into consideration there and work your way through. Next slide, please. Go. Now that's a good question, Rahul. So Rahul asks, is zero trust architecture relevant in ICS environments? That very much depends, Rahul, on which day of the week it is and who you're talking to. I like the principles of zero trust. There are a lot of people in the OT world, in the ICS environment, that are concerned about zero trust, mostly from perhaps a latency point of view, adding, because we are real time, we expect fast, scan times, depending on the environment. Perhaps, oil and gas is perhaps a bit more. In fact, substations as well, perhaps not as critical, but yeah, it depends. Personally, I think zero trust architecture is relevant, but I think just a good focus on architecture in the first place is the way to go. If we can segment out, both vertically but also horizontally as well, to stop lateral movement, that can be incredibly important as well. Continuous improvement. Yeah. So Peter, I think, has made another valid comment there around the zero trust. So look, lots of tools and standards out there. Clarity, Nozomi, a lot of IDS tools. The Grid Sentry guys are going to talk a little bit about their product afterwards. I use Tenable to unearth vulnerabilities in the OT world, especially around the servers. We use that a lot. Standards. Standards are our friend. Standards, guidelines, policies, procedures, frameworks. Whilst they can be um, cumbersome, whilst they can take some time to understand and certainly implement, standards can also help massively in leading you towards the right solutions. I've been working a lot recently with DOE. I'm in Saudi this week talking a lot about the OTCC standard, and there's a lot of good things in there. So 62443 and NIST as well. I like the approach in NIST because as we said, there's no silver bullet, but NIST builds from the ground up, and indeed, asset management as part of the governance, along with the GRC, the governance risk compliance, we kind of start there, and physical security and assessments before we get to the technology. We've built those solid foundations for your cybersecurity management system. So, and if you do it properly as well, the asset management part, the vulnerability management part, compliance is now becoming incredibly important. It used to be that we did compliance because, we kind of had to, not necessarily for the right reasons, but now the compliance is being driven hard. It's becoming a big issue for a lot of people. It can be very difficult, a minefield to work your way through. But with proper asset management, it helps guide you through that minefield, working within the frameworks. And indeed, if you manage your assets properly and you secure all of that data, it makes your compliance journey, and especially when you get to the audits, it makes all of that a lot easier to get through. So for me, following the standards and building from the ground up is always the way to go. So good point here about vulnerabilities and originating from third-party components. Yes, absolutely right, and that does make it difficult. And one thing I would always say, I talk as well about incident response and who should be in your cybersecurity team. And I always argue that third parties, your vendors, should be part of that team, part of that whole process, so that they get a better understanding of your process, you get a better understanding of what they're doing. One of the things I like about the direction of the 62443 standard is the introduction now of ISA Secure. For those of you that were involved, it's another thing that I used to do in my past was, safety integrity levels, using TUV 61508 and then 61511. I liked that whole process so that vendors could get their products certified to a safety integrity level, whether that be 1, 2, or 3, so that if you had the 3 main components of a safety integrity loop, such as the main controller in the ESD system, or the SIS as it is now, the actuator, and then the sensor, if they were all at a SIL 2, then you could reach SIL 2. If one of them was at SIL 1, you could only reach SIL 1. I'm seeing a lot of companies now moving towards ISA Secure and getting their products and indeed their systems certified by ISA. And it's certainly my hope that 2, 3, 4 years down the line, we're going to be very similar to the way we went on the safety side, so that from a cybersecurity perspective, we're going to be able to look at that and go, right, I know that product there is certified by ISA Secure. It reaches a cyber security level, a security level that meets my requirements. That's why I'm going to go and protect or purchase that equipment. So we're making some strides there, and I think that's the only way that we're going to be able to fully bring in the sort of third-party element to that to make sure that we're there. Okay, next slide, Gopal. Okay, so really just to wrap up on my side, and then we'll look at some more questions. start again with an accurate inventory, and even if that means manual, you can do packet captures, you can, and there's a whole variety of tools, right from the very basic all to the, the IDS and the tools like Tenable. All of that will give you an asset inventory, but you're still limited. If you look at some of the standards, for example, OTCC, I've been looking at this week, one of the stipulations in OTCC is that you assign an owner to an asset. That's not the sort of thing that, some of the IDS companies currently handle or deal with. So things like that, trap in, or capture in and log in the actual location. Basic things like that. And just an example of that is, I had this conversation yesterday. If you take SEC, for example, here in Saudi, some 1,500 substations, if they were to identify a vulnerability and a critical vulnerability, and that's for sake of argument, let's say a Siemens PLC, which had a critical vulnerability. If they didn't have a full and complete asset inventory, which also include the owner, but perhaps more importantly, the physical location, it's going to take them something like, full 1,500 visits in order to identify where all of these things are. And that's just a very basic example of where a full asset inventory will help you. But and we're all in the same boat. I'm sure all of us subscribe to these vulnerability feeds coming from various sources, whether it be CVE databases or indeed bombarded from, the vendors that you work with. Maybe 5% of those will actually be meaningful to you, but sifting through all that can take an incredible amount of time. So a fuller asset database and therefore an accurate vulnerability assessment or the ability to assess those vulnerabilities is absolutely key to making sure that you spend your time and resource and money in the right places. So for me, it's always around the asset inventory and proper asset management. That's where you start. Don't isolate yourself in the OT world. I'm an OT guy. I don't like IT people. We talk a different language. But that's not necessarily the best way to do it. Get your OT guys, get your IT guys, your engineering guys, your maintenance guys that are out in the field, get those here. One of the things we talk about a lot is when we try to recover, if and when you get attacked, when you try to recover, we're under a huge amount of pressure to get your plant back to normal, get it up and running. Who in your organization understands what normal is? Unless you're doing the configuration management as part of your asset management, unless you're baselining your system, how do you know that you get back to normal? And this is why guys like, the maintenance people and indeed the operators who have perhaps sat there looking at the screens for 20 years and understand how the process works. This is where it's important to make sure that these guys are all part of your team. Peter asks a question there around categorizing your criticality levels. And this always seems to be the last thing that we get around to doing. But and yes, if it's a large installation, this can be difficult. But I would argue here that from a risk-based approach, this is really key because coming back to my earlier point, we don't have enough money to go around. We have a lack of good qualified OT cybersecurity people in our world. We're losing our good OT people, to retirement. And it's the same conversation we've been having, even in the OT environment in general. We've been losing all of that knowledge and experience because everybody that goes to university these days, wants to do gaming or some of the new stuff. Some of them will do cybersecurity. I interviewed 3 cybersecurity possible interns this morning, graduates here in Saudi, and but had no appreciation as to what OT was. A little bit about firewalls, just wanting to talk about IT. There is a lack of talent in the OT world, there's certainly a lack of talent coming into the OT world. So being focused and prioritizing where we spend our money, where we spend our time, I think is becoming more and more important in our marketplace. And I think it's something that we can't ignore any longer. It's something that we must do. So another question here on AI-driven threat detection. This is a great question. And you know, why not? I mean, I'm old enough to remember the original Terminator films with Cyberdyne systems, and you know, so for guys like me and Peter, you know, we know where this ends up. You know, we know how this finishes. But you know, AI is there, and AI to some extent can be our friend. You know, we're just launching a platform where I work at OT Nexus, and we're using AI to uncover the vulnerabilities. You know, we need a full asset database to do that. You know, and that's the problem with AI. AI is only as good. It needs a lot of data. In order to make those decisions to pull it out. But it's interesting. I mean, I see Nozomi now talking about AI. I'm sure the Grid Sentry guys are going to be talking about that. There's another couple of companies that are now coming out of America that are now, because one of the downfalls, and this is, you know, the Grid Sentry guys are going to talk about their system. You know, some of the older IDS companies effectively are you know, replicating all of the traffic on your network, and that's not really what we want. What we want is a AI driven system that spends all of its time looking for threats, and that's based on your vulnerabilities, understanding what vulnerabilities you've got, and then looking for the threats that are looking to exploit those vulnerabilities. So I'm all for that. I find it quite interesting that you know, the continuous monitoring part. I think there has to be a drive there towards AI threat detection, because again, I think that focuses your resources and your time really where it needs to be. Yeah, so Peter makes a good comment, and I often taught there was a you know, the difference between the IT and OT. There was a comedy program in the UK, and a lot of you probably don't know it, but the IT crowd, you know, and somebody would ring up, they'd pick up the phone. Have you turned it off and turned it back on again? And they would put the phone down. That was the IT support. Of course, we don't have that luxury in our world. And when I talk about incident response, you know, the pressure for us to get the site up and running again, get back to normal as quickly as possible is really quite intense, you know. But once we're at that containment stage, you know, a big part of that has to be trying to understand the investigation, you know, the forensics, you know, extracting all of that information. So, you know, before you know, so that containment part, before you do the eradication, you've got to understand what was going on. So yeah, it's a big part, and everything we do seemingly in the OT world is difficult. So we need to be very aware of that. Yes, good point. 61850. Some of those new standards that are specific to the you know, in this case the substation, the power world, I think are really going to help us. Okay, question here. So risk assessment, mostly power order. Yeah, order severity. Yeah, yeah. I honestly, I think with a risk assessment, or indeed if you're any sort of assessment, you know, I to my mind, it's not relevant unless you prioritize it. You know, I think if it's gap analysis or vulnerability assessment, whatever type of assessment, absolutely, you've got to prioritize it, give it a severity, you know, so that they understand where to spend their money, where to spend their time. So yeah, good point. So look, in conclusion, I made the point here. We kind of seem to have jumped all past machine learning, don't we? We've gone straight. A few years ago we were talking about machine learning. Now AI is all we talk about. So, but I think that there has to be a smarter way for anomaly detection. Absolutely. You know, passive monitoring now seems to have been accepted, and I think it's up to us to drive you know, our you know, towards that. And if I want to leave you with one last point, I again, there's no silver bullet. Um, and the chances of you getting the budget to achieve everything that you want to do is also slim. So as with any project, you're looking for those small wins so that you can show a return on investment, and then hopefully in year two you get a slightly bigger budget, year three, and you keep improving it. So, I what I would say is there are things you can do now, and including the assessments are absolutely key. And working through the very basics of hardening, be looking at that. A lot of advice and guidance on hardening and how that can help in the substation environment. Scale it up gradually. But please integrate both your asset and vulnerability views. Make sure you've got all of that data and make it visible. One of the concerns I have is that we've got IDS, we've got, so your CMCs, we've got your management tools for your firewalls, we've got EPO, we've got Active Directory, we've got, domain controllers, everything that we're deploying there, and people are looking, we're going from a very reactive approach to the way we ran our substations, and certainly the way we protected, to all of a sudden having all of this data, and it's overwhelming for the majority of people. So look at asset management platforms. There's a lot of them out there. We're now developed one. We're launching a new one that's using AI. Look at these tools, because that visualization of what's going on is really going to help you prioritize and make sense, and enable you to make the informed decisions. So start now, scale up gradually, but make sure you integrate both your asset and your vulnerability views. Okay, and I know I've already gone over my time, so I apologize, Gopal.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Simon. Thanks a lot for the